Anna from NHCSR here. It is wintertime. Now is the time that we are thinking about pruning fruit trees when they are dormant. It also is a very good time to be ready for a plan in the spring to think about fertilization. So every year, blueberry season, fertilization, it always sneaks up on me and I want to be ready with a plan. The best time of year to fertilize your blueberries is right after bud break. So when that first flush of growth comes out, that's the best time to fertilize. Even better if you split that rate between that period and again when plants start producing fruit or right after harvest. Make sure not to fertilize after that, so after August or so, because if you fertilize too late in the year, it signals that plant that it's time to grow rather than what it should be doing, which is getting ready for the next winter. So keep that in mind. What to use. For a home gardener, you could absolutely run out and get a bag that says 4 blueberries on it. Nothing's stopping you. Just follow the bag's instructions. It's typically a granular that you apply evenly over the soil. You might scratch it into the soil and then water, either through rain or irrigation, gets that material down to the root zone. Now, you might read a few things on the internet that say, that's really expensive, or that's, or it's for chumps. Because technically you are kind of paying through the teeth on a per acre basis. A commercial grower who is worried about making a profit, more interested in yield than you might be, they're probably not running out and getting a bag that says 4 blueberries. But I wouldn't overthink this too much. Think about why you're growing blueberries. You're not growing on a per acre basis. You're growing for joy and entertainment. Furthermore, I could say you could get away with using just a regular fertilizer as long as you have the right rates. Why not even an Osmocote? Those little ball things that release fertilizer slow but sure over time? Why not? Just don't overdo it in the first year. Young plants can be very sensitive to over-fertilization in the first couple of years. Wait until it's mature and you can crank that rate up. Every extension agency out there will provide you with some information about how to do this if you want to go that way. But you likely will have heard that blueberries thrive in acid soils, so low pH soils. I am not a soil scientist or a crop physiologist, so given that this is not my area of expertise, I am going to speak in generalities that might make an expert wince. So gird your loins if any of my expert friends in this are listening. But the best thing to keep in mind whenever you're talking about soil pH is it's almost always tied to nutrient availability of something else. So it's not necessarily the pH of the soil that's impacting the plant. It has to do with the availability of other stuff in the soil that the plants want and need for growth. In the case of blueberry plants, the type of nitrogen they prefer is more available in low acid environments. That's all you really need to know. Going a little bit deeper in there, urea is a nitrogen source that is in most fertilizers. It's the kind of biggest bang for your buck in terms of nitrogen. In ideal circumstances for blueberries, you would be applying the more expensive version, the ammonium-based nitrogens, and that low pH would keep the ammonium-based nitrogen in the form that the blueberries like. Both are fine. Just one is more better than the other. Also, you may have heard that putting coffee grounds or pine needles on your soil will help acidify your soil. There's nothing wrong with either of these practices. Adding more organic matter to your soil is always good. Unfortunately, that won't change the pH of your soil. These are all old wives' tales. Commercial operations typically use a wood mulch. So they're applying wood mulches, either bark wood mulches or sawdust, whatever they can get their hands on. And they're applying that every year, year after year. So the reason they're doing this is mostly for weed management, soil moisture management. In some areas, people are doing this as an IPM practice to help manage a disease called mummyberry. There's inoculum living in the soil and covering it up can help. But over time, this practice does impact soil pH. It will lower soil pH over time. The same goes for common fertilization practices. So using urea year after year will slowly but surely lower that soil pH by about 0.1 pH units per year. You can kind of see where soil testing is important when folks are deciding what amendments to make year after year, you might want to back off on some of these things if you already have really acid soil. Nitrogen always feels like a real black box because of all these moving targets. It's a really ephemeral thing. Like, you don't even see nitrogen on your soil test, you just see pH. Something that commercial growers do very often is rely on a tissue test later on in the season. So you're making your soil amendments early in the season when the plants are just coming on. After harvest or around that time, you'd be sending off tissue test leaves to your local extension service to kind of check your work, right? So of all the assumptions you made about what your soil is like, what to add to it, you can test the plant to see if it's performing the way that you think. So this is something that commercial growers do all the time. This service is definitely available to home growers. Reach out to your local extension office to find out more about that if you're into it. But, most people, they kind of decide with how happy they are with their fertilizer regime by looking at how healthy the plants are. Are they nice and green and lush every year? Do they produce fruit? Keep in mind why you're doing this. However, you might be stuck with really stubborn alkaline soil that doesn't go anywhere, and you might be wondering what to do. I came across a paper from the University of Guelph, and I just love everything that comes out of Guelph. It's just that really sweet spot of really nicely done science and really applicable work. This paper was brought to us from funding from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada through the Canadian Ornamental Horticultural Alliance. So that is pretty squeaky clean. It looks like some of the materials were donated from local suppliers. So some of the decisions that they made when they were designing these experiments were based on what they had available to them in their local environment. Authors say here, okay, for home gardeners in particular, in-ground cultivation of blueberry plants is often not possible because of these low soil pH requirements. Therefore, containerized blueberry might be a promising alternative. So growing that blueberry in a pot with different substrate than the soil that you're stuck with. Others are also thinking about what to recommend for the nursery industry that might be producing these. They are already producing containerized blueberries in smaller containers that are going to be removed and planted into the ground. They're kind of saying like, oh, maybe there's a market for a more mature plant that could be sold to a homeowner and stay in that container. Authors also speculate that for this market, having organic practices would be highly valued. Homeowners really like organic production. So this would also be a good time to mention that all the stuff that I said before about fertilizers, none of those things are organic. So, if you want to be organic, don't listen to anything I just said. Things do get very complicated when you start swapping out organic fertilizers with conventional fertilizers. It's kind of above my pay grade. I'm not sure exactly what happens. There's chemistry, there's soil science going on there when you're having these things interacting with real mineral soils. However, this paper will provide us some insights into using organic fertilizers in these containerized systems, and some of this stuff can be applied to soil systems, so keep that in mind. Authors start out this paper with some time deliberating about the best substrate to use, so soilless media in these containers, the best potting mix. There's no industry standard for this because outside of the nurseries that produce the nursery stock, those young plants, commercial growers aren't growing blueberry plants in containers. Authors cite successful growing substrates for potted blueberries included components such as coir, perlite, turf, peat, bark, wood fiber, sphagnum moss, and sand. So keep in mind that the commercial green industry, so people who are growing plants in containers and selling them, they are really trying to find alternatives for peat moss in these ornamental containers. It's a finite resource. For lack of a better term, peat moss, the stuff that you usually find in these containers, is mined. Kind of. It's dug out of ancient bogs. It would take a few thousand years to make more of this stuff. If you are regularly buying bedding plants or house plants, you might come across this material called coir. This is a potential alternative to peat moss, it's coconut husk. You might also see blends of wood fiber mixed in. You're not seeing 100% wood fiber. It's usually, mixing in with peat. And the authors settled on 2 different substrates to use. One for conventional growing. This is a mix of that composted pine bark, coir, and peat. So they're still using peat, but much less of it. The organic substrate they settled on was a 100% organically produced coir. Here, authors evaluated different fertilizer types as well as a range of rates, and they made several measurements over a 2-year study. They used Osmocote as their standard conventional fertilizer, and they evaluated a granular and a liquid type for their organic treatments. These are commercial blends used as fertilizer. There are blends of sulfate of potash, guano soft rock phosphate, feather meals, bone meals, sulfate of potash, magnesia, soybean meals, and humic acid derivatives. This experiment was conducted outside, kind of in a nursery production setting, so they also provide some information on environmental conditions like temperature, rain, things like that. All right. So the data. This figure shows the macronutrients in the organic treatments over time. For this figure, they're looking at just one rate, using organic granular or organic liquid in that 100% core substrate. They have 2 different measurements of nitrogen. The nitrate nitrogen and the ammonium nitrate are on the left. If you remember, ammonium nitrate is the one that's a little bit better for blueberries. Phosphorus and potassium are on the right. Phosphorus and potassium are very important for flowering and fruiting. Those dotted lines indicate when applications were made. There is a lot to unpack here. I'm not going to go too far, but the take home is that the levels are different. They're different depending on their fertilizer over time, and particularly because of environmental conditions and because the substrate is aging. This figure shows the EC on the top and the pH on the bottom for all the combinations of substrates, fertilizers, and fertilization rates. One of the core objectives here is whether or not pH is maintained, and I think that this demonstrates that pH is maintained. EC stands for electrical conductivity. EC is a stand-in for how many nutrients are in a container. So it's not a perfect stand-in for nutrient management because it measures the amount of salts generically that are coming out of the container when it's irrigated. So they're irrigating it, they're collecting the water that comes out, and they're making their measurements based on what comes out of the pot. This method was originally developed to help container growers manage over-fertilization. So if you're measuring a lot of stuff coming out, you need to come back on your fertilization. You're wasting time and money. Here, it's a less than perfect stand-in measurement that researchers lean on a lot when they're interested in nutrient management. One little thing to notice is that the range of EC coming out of the liquid organic treatment is much wider than the conventional or the organic granular, so you would have a greater potential to over-fertilize when you're using a liquid. All right, so what we're really interested in here is the influence of any of these regimes on growth and fruiting. This figure shows the growth index in the first and second years when using that Osmocote versus the organic granular or liquid at 5 different rates. And so we are getting pretty consistent results for the Osmocote in the first year with that slow release. It's resulting in similar growth independent of whatever rate is being applied. This breaks down in the second year, which may have to do with interactions with the substrate or other abiotic factors. We do see a sweet spot in that organic fertilizer around 10 grams of nitrogen per pot. They are presenting these rates a little bit differently when it comes to the organic versus the liquid, just based on the availability of the nitrogen. But you're showing kind of the same thing, that after a certain point, you are not gaining anything in growth index if you're applying too much fertilizer. They do find a similar pattern looking at chlorophyll content in the leaves. I won't show you that. It's a measurement of how productive the leaves are, but it kind of says the same thing. Moreover, authors also mentioned that plants grown with high rates in their first year showed poor overall appearance. interveinal chlorosis. The plants just looked bad if they had too much nitrogen. This confirms what we know about blueberry plants. They're being a little bit oversensitive to over-fertilization, too many salts, especially in their first years before they become mature. Then looking at fruit weight in the second year, we see that sweet spot is reflected in all three treatments. So even though the negative influence of over-fertilization was not seen in the growth index in the first year with the Osmocote, this did negatively influence fruit production. This makes sense to me. Flowering and fruiting are more influenced by the balance of all of those macronutrients. So even though you have sufficient potassium and phosphorus, too much nitrogen can throw things off because it's about the ratio of those components more than how much of any one macronutrient you have. Authors conclude that even though the results of the study indicate that the liquid organic fertilizer was not a suitable approach for this system, there's still a lot of benefits for using liquid fertilizers in some circumstances. So further work would certainly need to be done to hone in on how to use those, but there's still a place for them in a lot of circumstances. So the take-home message for you home gardeners out there: you can grow blueberry bushes in containers. Who would have thought? Make sure to fertilize them every year. Don't do it too much, but do it every year. And the same goes for folks who are establishing blueberries in the ground in their yards. After plants mature, you can increase that fertilization rate, but keep it slow and steady in the first 3 or so years. Let me know if you want to know more about this. What kind of fertilizers are you using for your fruit crops? What are other springtime practices that you want to know more about to make sure that you're on top of things? So let me know, and thanks for listening.